So in this video, I'm going to talk about the multiple selves hypothesis. So I just picked this up and just started it, but I'll give you an update as I finish it off. But it seems, at least on the surface, that it is very consistent with the no self hypothesis, which is to say no single self hypothesis. And this is the mess that we get into as human beings. When we're young, someone comes along and says, "What do you want to do?" And they simply assume the single self hypothesis as if you just want to be a lawyer, and they don't recognize the multiplicity. And yet we're slowly, in the same way that we're dissolving the single self hypothesis, we're also embracing the multiple selves hypothesis. Even though this has been around for quite a while, and I'll go over some of the psychological data that demonstrates that. But let's just start off with Jung. So even though part of you may want to be a rock star, but some other part wants the security of a well-paying job, and then some other part wants to be married, but some other part doesn't, but some other part wants this, and you can go through the whole long list, and you realize that it is an absolute multiplicity, and it's experienced as what we call conflict. And so it's very difficult to maintain the single self hypothesis and the human experience of conflict at the same time. So every morning I go off for my jog, and this guy passes me every morning in about $150,000 Porsche. And there's no doubt part of me would like to own that Porsche. It looks like it would be quite a bit of fun, but there's another part of me that's really happy I'm not driving that Porsche, because I'd be going off to some job, and I like to have, and there's another part of me that really enjoys having slow, relaxing mornings. So when we go over the psychological data, the single self hypothesis just doesn't seem to hold up. So let's look at Milgram first. And so this is the famous experiment of obedience. And it's true, most of the subjects were obedient. But the other clear thing of the data, even when it was replicated, I think 96, was that the subjects didn't want to do what they were doing. So there's clear, I mean, you could, if you watch the videos, there's such clear conflict with the participants themselves. And again, that conflict strongly suggests a multiplicity of selves. The most popular theory in psychology is called cognitive dissonance theory. And there's no way this theory could exist unless there was a multiplicity, because cognitive dissonance is whenever there is dissonance, differences between our thoughts, feelings, and actions. And so those all represent different spheres of our different selves. And when they're in conflict, we are motivated towards dissonance or pain. And that does also help us understand why, in spite of all the data, we're motivated towards the single self hypothesis, because we're motivated towards consistency. But remember, and I've shown this in so many videos, consistency is just a motivation driven by the left side of your brain to become consistent. And that drives the single self hypothesis. So conflict, whether it's Freud's conflict and his multiple selves were between the id, ego, and superego, which roughly you could separate all those into all kinds of multiplicity also. So his way of separating the cells was kind of simplistic, but it also does hold up to explain our experiences. And that's why Freud is still so popular. Remember Eckhart Tolle, when he described his experience right before enlightenment, he put it like this. He said, "I could no longer stand myself." Now, from a single self hypothesis, that sounds almost, well, totally bizarre. But from a multiple selves hypothesis, it makes perfect sense. The conflict between the multiplicity. In fact, what happened with Eckhart could be very likely that he first experienced the multiple selves, and the multiple selves hypothesis is what dissolved the single self hypothesis. So perhaps again, my videos are all over the place because I don't embrace consistency. I keep using that linguistically, but you know what I mean. There's this idea that there are many ways up to the top of the mountain, and I just provide as many ways as I can. And so you could go either way. You could first dissolve the single self hypothesis, and that might lead into the multiple selves hypothesis, and that seemed to be the path that I was on. But I think you could go the other way. First, embrace the multiple selves, and simultaneously with that, the single self hypothesis may dissolve. So embracing the multitude. And so, sure, some part of you may think you want to be a lawyer, but some other part of you may think that would be completely horrible. And that's why conflict is such a human experience. And that's why we have existential anxiety, existential depression. No other animal on the planet has these types of experiences. Sure, animals, other species get angry, but it's just like a Zen master. The anger happens and then it passes. But in order to maintain this illusion of a single self, we have to repress all of these conflicting emotions. And when you look into the emotional literature, that's why emotions actually linger around so much, because, well, the dog that gets angry, or the infant that gets angry for a few seconds, it passes because the anger has expressed itself. But when we force this single self hypothesis and conflicting emotions get buried, then in a very Freudian sense, they seem to linger around. And of course, another way that we fall for this is we say, I am depressed. And it's certainly possible that there are cases where all the multiple selves are in perfect harmony and they all are singing a song of depression or anxiety. But I think for most of us, what happens is, when I say us in both ways, us is in all of us, but us is in the us inside the skull. And in that sense, it's not that we are depressed, or I am depressed. It's that there's just a part of the symphony that is depressed. And when you put it that way, one, there's far more hope. If there's only one depressing piece of the orchestra, but the rest of the orchestra is fine, that's a whole different story than the totality of even saying, I am anxious or I am depressed. And try it out. It's this part of me is anxious at this moment. Everything changes. So that this morning I was out for my jog again every morning, and it was raining. And there's no doubt there was a part of me, like a grumpy old man who was just like, why does it have to rain? And as soon as I stopped jogging, the sun came out, and that part of it, it's just like cranky, because it's like, well, why did the sun have to come out right after I'm finished? But as I was running, there's an embracing of the multiplicity. So there was also a child who wanted to, jump in the puddles, and really enjoyed the whole experience. And so by embracing the multiplicity, you see that there's no single drive that's underlying any particular experience. And that reflects the whole yin yang, I think, of Taoism. There's always a little bit of the good and a little bit of the bad, all embracing any experience. And try it out. I think when you try it out, it could be another way up the mountain to find that there was no self in the first place.